The second I turned 18, I moved my father's $45 million into an irrevocable trust. Next morning, my mother slid the papers across the counter and smiled like she hadn't already picked out my replacement. The second I legally turned 18, I quietly moved my late father's $45 million inheritance into an irrevocable trust. Thank God I did, because the next morning, in our Beverly Hills mansion, my mother pushed a manila folder across the marble kitchen island and said, "Just sign, sweetheart," while my stepfather stood behind her like a man closing a merger, and my half-sister was already picturing a Porsche, a skincare empire, and a future paid for with money that had never been theirs. I want to tell you how I got there, because 18-year-olds aren't supposed to know what a spendthrift clause is, or what irrevocable actually means in a courtroom. I didn't either, 3 weeks earlier. I learned fast. I had to. My name is Ren Paul. My father was David Paul. And this is the story of the 2 weeks that turned me from a name on a trust document into someone my family will spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to their own lawyers. I'd been living in that house for 6 years, ever since my mother married Harrison Voss. 6 years of learning which smiles were real and which ones were performance. My father died when I was 9, a boating accident off Catalina, the kind of tragedy people whisper about at country clubs for exactly 1 season before they forget. He left behind a shipping logistics company he'd built from a single leased warehouse in Long Beach, and by the time it was sold off after his death, the total estate came to just over $45 million, held in trust for me until I turned 18. My mother Diane remarried 2 years later. 2. Harrison Voss ran, or claimed to run, a disruptive fintech startup called Voss Capital Dynamics, the kind of company that had a slick website, a rotating cast of chief strategy officers, and, as I'd later learn, a burn rate that would make a hedge fund manager wince. My half-sister Serena, Harrison's daughter from his first marriage, had built a skincare brand called Lumiere REX that had exactly 40,000 followers and a warehouse full of unsold inventory. I want to be clear, I wasn't naive. I knew Harrison didn't love me the way he loved Serena. I knew my mother had softened over the years, had started calling me sweetheart a little too often, in the specific tone people use when they're trying to convince themselves of something. But I told myself families are complicated. I told myself 6 years of birthdays and holidays and awkward Thanksgivings meant something. Then, on a Tuesday in early June, 17 days before my 18th birthday, I walked into the kitchen at 6:40 p.m. to grab a glass of water, and Harrison's iPad was sitting on the island, unlocked, screen glowing. A notification banner sat at the top. Paul Family Capital LLC, draft ready for review. Bancroft and Weiss LLP. My name was in the preview text. So was my father's. I stood there for a full 10 seconds telling myself it was nothing. A retirement fund, a college savings update, something boring and administrative. That's the thing about denial. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly hands you an excuse and waits to see if you'll take it. I didn't take it. I tapped the notification. 42 pages loaded. I skimmed the first, and my stomach did something I can only describe as a slow-motion drop, the kind you feel in an elevator when the cable seems to catch for half a second too long. Section 4. Harrison James Voss to serve as managing director of Paul Family Capital LLC with sole discretion over investment allocation. Section 9. Initial capital infusion of $12,000 designated for operational funding of Voss Capital Dynamics. Section 11. Establishment of a $4,500,000 revolving marketing and inventory fund for Lumiere RX LLC, dispersed quarterly at the direction of the managing director. Section 14. The one that made my hands go cold. Upon the beneficiary's 18th birthday, 80% of assets held in the David Paul Testamentary Trust shall be transferred into Paul Family Capital LLC. Diane Voss shall serve as trustee. The beneficiary shall retain a 20% minority, non-voting interest. I photographed every single page. My hands were shaking so badly the first 4 photos came out blurred, and I had to stop, breathe, brace my elbows against the counter like I was aiming a rifle, and try again. Then I locked the iPad, set it back down at the exact angle I'd found it, and walked upstairs like my legs belonged to someone else. That night at dinner, Harrison asked how my day was. Productive, I said. I learned a lot about how systems work. He smiled, that easy, practice smile he used at his own board meetings, I'd bet, and said, "That's my girl. Systems thinking. That'll get you far." He had no idea how far. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Not that night anyway. I lay in bed running the math over and over. 80% of $45 million was $36 million. Moving into a company controlled by a man who had, by my count, run through at least 2 prior ventures into bankruptcy before marrying my mother. I didn't need a law degree to know that sole discretion over investment allocation and revolving fund dispersed at the direction of the managing director meant one thing. Once that money moved, it was gone. Not stolen in one dramatic heist. Bled out slowly through consulting fees and marketing budgets and operational shortfalls until there was nothing left to claim. The next morning, I called in sick to school. A first for me, I was the kid who showed up to AP Calc with a 102-degree fever and drove to the one person I could think of who might actually help, Elias Thorne. Elias had been my father's attorney for nearly a decade before his death. He'd handled the original estate planning, and though my mother had switched the family's legal representation to Harrison's people the year after the wedding, Elias had sent a card every year on the anniversary of my father's death. Just a card, no agenda. I'd always found that strange. strange, in a good way, in a house full of people who had agendas for everything. His office was in a converted brownstone in Pasadena, the kind of place that looked more like a study than a law firm. Walls of case law, a Newton's cradle on the desk that had clearly never been dusted. Elias Thorne was 61 years old, a member of the California State Bar for 34 years, and had spent the last 15 specializing in trust and estate litigation. After a decade in corporate law that he once described to me, dryly, as learning how the wolves think so I could stop being one. He read through the photos on my phone without saying a word. I watched his jaw tighten, watched him scroll back up to reread Section 14 twice. "This isn't a family agreement," he finally said. "This is legal theft, dressed up in a suit." "Is it even legal?" I asked. "Can they actually make me sign this?" "They can't make you do anything," he said. "But you're a minor for 17 more days, and the second you're not, they're going to have this document in front of you with a pen and a great deal of emotional pressure behind it. People sign things under pressure they'd never sign with a clear head. That's the whole design." "What would my dad do?" I asked. It surprised me how much my voice cracked on the word dad. I hadn't said it out loud in a while. Elias looked out the window for a long moment. "Your father never played a rigged game by their rules," he said. "He rewrote the rules first, every single time." He opened his desk drawer and took out an old fountain pen, heavy, black lacquer, a thin gold band near the nib, and set it in front of me. "He gave me this to hold on to," Elias said, "in case you ever needed it. I think you need it now. Here's what nobody tells you about surviving something like this. The hardest part isn't the plan. It's the performance you have to give while the plan is happening." For 2 weeks, I smiled at dinner. I sat with Serena and picked out fabric swatches for her brand relaunch photo shoot, nodding along as she described a marketing strategy that was, essentially, post more and hope. I let my mother touch my shoulder and call me sweetheart, and I did not flinch, though every time she did it, my skin felt like it was trying to crawl somewhere else. Harrison started leaving business magazines open around the house, Forbes, Inc., to articles about family capital structures and generational wealth stewardship. Certain phrases circled in blue pen. It was almost funny, in retrospect, how unsubtle it was. He genuinely believed I was a child who could be primed like a light switch. Serena, for her part, had stopped even pretending to be nice. One afternoon, when I mentioned I'd been looking into business programs for college, she laughed. Not cruelly, just carelessly, the way you laugh at something you've never had to think twice about. "You know your lane, right?" she said, not even looking up from her phone. "Dad's handling the business side. You don't need to worry about any of that." I smiled and said, "Sure." Inside, I filed that sentence away like evidence. I planned to make her eat it, syllable by syllable. Behind their backs, Elias and I worked fast. He connected me with Lydia Farrow, a fiduciary advisor at Vanguard Fiduciary Group with 22 years of experience in trust structuring, who specialized, and I promise this detail is real, not poetic license, in what she called adversarial family succession, meaning trusts built specifically to withstand pressure from the beneficiary's own relatives. Our first call with Lydia happened on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was supposedly at a college prep study session at the library. I sat in my car in the parking garage, engine off, laptop balanced on the steering wheel, sweating through my shirt even with the windows cracked. "I want to be direct with you," Lydia said, once Elias had walked her through the Paul family capital documents. "I've seen structures like this before, not often this blatant, but the mechanics are familiar. Usually it's a step-parent, sometimes a sibling, occasionally a business partner of the deceased. The pattern is always the same. Pressure applied right at the moment of legal transition, when the beneficiary is least equipped to resist." "Is there anything actually stopping me from just not signing?" I asked. "Can't I just say no?" "You can," Lydia said, "but saying no to a folder in a kitchen isn't the same as protecting the asset. Verbal refusal doesn't create a legal barrier. If you turn 18 with the trust still sitting under its original terms, and your mother remains custodial trustee even for a single day past your birthday, there are ways that structure could still be manipulated. Undue influence claims cut both directions, and family court disputes over capacity and consent get messy and slow. The cleanest solution isn't refusing their paperwork. It's making their paperwork irrelevant before they ever put it in front of you." That phrase stuck with me. Make their paperwork irrelevant. It became something like a mantra over the following days, whispered under my breath while I sat through dinners describing fabric swatches, while I nodded along to Harrison's magazine articles, while I let my mother touch my shoulder like nothing at all was wrong. Together, the three of us built a new instrument, the David Paul Legacy Trust, irrevocable. Self-executing at the moment I turned 18, requiring nothing more than a single authenticated digital transfer from the original testamentary trust, which crucially I already had limited access rights to, since I was the named beneficiary, and the trust's own terms allowed transfer to a qualified successor trust upon majority, without requiring Diane's sign-off as the outgoing custodial trustee. Elias had found that clause in my father's original 2016 trust documents, buried in Section 22, subsection C. I don't think my father even remembered writing it. I think he just built the exits in, out of habit, the way careful people always do. No Harrison, no Diane, no Serena, not now, not ever, not by any future amendment, because the trust language explicitly barred any of the three from serving as trustee, advisor, or beneficiary at any point under any circumstance permanently. Elias called it a wall you build so tall no lawyer alive can climb climate. Lydia called it more simply airtight. The night before my birthday, my mother made salmon. It was the exact dish, down to the dill and the little charred lemon wedges, that she used to make for my father on their anniversary. I hadn't had it since I was 9 years old. She set the plate in front of me and smiled like she meant it. It tasted like bait. I said goodnight around 10, walked upstairs, and for the first time in 6 years, I jammed the desk chair under my bedroom door handle. At 11:50 p.m., I opened my laptop. Elias was already on a video call, sitting in his home office in a cardigan instead of a suit, looking like someone's favorite uncle instead of the man about to help me detonate a bomb inside my own family. Lydia joined a moment later from what looked like her kitchen table, a mug of tea steaming beside her keyboard. "Once you turn 18 at midnight," Lydia said, "the transfer authorization becomes valid. I'll need your digital signature and a one-time verification code sent to your phone. After that, it's done. Immediately. No waiting period." "And there's no way to undo it? For anyone?" I asked, my throat tight. "Not for anyone," Elias said. "Not even you, actually. That's the point." At 12:01 a.m., on my 18th birthday, a green button appeared on my screen. Transfer $45,230,880 to the David Paul Legacy Trust. I looked at it for maybe 3 full seconds. I thought about my father, about a man I mostly remembered through photographs and the smell of a specific cologne I'd catch sometimes on strangers in elevators and have to excuse myself. I thought about the word sweetheart said in a voice that didn't mean it. I thought about, you know your lane. I clicked it. The loading wheel spun for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then, transfer complete. Funds secured. Trustee confirmed. David Paul Legacy Trust. Vanguard Fiduciary Group. You're untouchable now, Elias said quietly. "Happy birthday, Ren." I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, my heart still hammering against my ribs. Downstairs, 3 floors below me, my family was asleep, still believing that in about 8 hours, they'd own my father's company. They didn't. Not anymore. Not ever again. At 8 in the morning, I showered, got dressed, and walked downstairs like it was any other day. The trap was set exactly the way I knew it would be. My mother sat at the island with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, just holding, the way people hold things when they need something to do with their hands. Harrison leaned against the counter in a blazer, at 8 a.m. She on a Saturday, in his own kitchen, like a man about to close a deal instead of celebrate his stepdaughter's birthday. Next to a small birthday pastry with a single unlit candle sat a thick manila folder and a cheap blue ballpoint pen. "There's my girl," my mother said, standing to hug me. Her perfume was the same one from the night before. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." "Thanks, Mom." Harrison slid the folder across the counter with 2 fingers, like he was dealing cards. "Don't get lost in the legal language," he said. "Just sign where it's flagged. We'll celebrate properly tonight." I opened the folder. I read every page slowly, deliberately, tracing my finger down each paragraph just to watch them squirm in real time. Serena wandered in halfway through, still in pajamas, scrolling her phone, already halfway through a sentence about wanting to look at Porsche configurations later that day. She stopped talking when she noticed the silence in the room. "It's just standard paperwork," Harrison said, a little too quickly. "Family wealth management, that's all. Consolidating things to make everyone's life easier." I kept reading. I let the silence stretch. Their smiles started to crack at the edges. My mother's first, a small tremor at the corner of her mouth, then Harrison's, his jaw tightening the way it did in the fintech pitch videos I'd found online at 2 a.m. the week before, right before he'd say something aggressive dressed up as confidence. Finally, I looked up. "Paul Family Capital LLC," I said, my voice even. "Drafted by Lance Bancroft, filed with the Secretary of State 14 days ago. Section 4 names Harrison as managing director with sole discretion over allocation. Section 9 allocates $12 million to Voss Capital Dynamics. Section 11 sets up a revolving fund for Lumiere RX. Section 14 moves 80% of my father's trust into this company, effective today, with me holding a 20% non-voting minority stake." The kitchen went completely silent. Even the refrigerator seemed to stop humming. "How do you—" my mother started. "You don't understand the full picture," Harrison cut in, his voice sliding into the tone he probably used on investors who asked too many questions. "This protects the family. It protects you. You're 18. You have no experience managing this kind of capital. This is standard practice for—" "I understand it perfectly," I said. "This isn't protection. This is theft with a bow tied on it." His face changed then. I want to describe it accurately, because it mattered to me, watching it happen. The mask didn't shatter all at once. It cracked in layers. First, the practiced warmth drained out of his eyes. Then his mouth went hard and flat. By the time he spoke again, the man standing in front of me wasn't the stepfather who'd taught me to parallel park, or the guy who cried actual tears at Serena's high school graduation. He was someone colder. Someone I don't think I'd ever actually met before that morning, despite 6 years under the same roof. "Sign it," he said, "or you're out by noon. Let's see how long your little rebellion lasts sleeping in your Honda." I didn't have a Honda. I drove a hand-me-down Lexus my mother had given me for my 16th birthday, back when she still performed affection more convincingly. But I understood the sentiment. I was supposed to picture myself homeless, humiliated, begging. Instead, I picked up my phone from the counter, unlocked it, and set it down between us, on speaker. I pressed one contact and hit call. It started ringing, the sound tinny and enormous in the silent kitchen. "Good morning, Harrison," said a voice through the speaker. Calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had clearly been waiting for this call. Harrison's Harrison's face went white as printer paper. "Who is this?" Harrison said. It wasn't really a question. His voice had lost its boardroom polish entirely. "Elias Thorne," the voice said. "I represented David Paul for 9 years before his death, and I currently represent his daughter, Wren. I understand you have some paperwork out this morning." "This is a family matter," Harrison said. "I don't know how you got this number, but Wren called me," Elias said, mild as ever. "She's my client. Has been for a couple of weeks now, actually. I'd like to save everyone some time this morning, if I may." My mother had gone very still, one hand pressed flat against the counter like she needed it to stay upright. At 12:01 a.m. "Last night," Elias continued, "Wren, acting entirely within her legal rights as the sole named beneficiary of the David Paul Testamentary Trust, exercised a successor trust clause contained in Section 22, subsection C of her father's original 2016 trust documents. That clause permits transfer of trust assets to a qualified irrevocable successor trust upon the beneficiary reaching the age of majority, without requiring authorization from the outgoing custodial trustee." "That's not," my mother started. "It's entirely legal, Diane," Elias said, and something in the way he used her first name, flat and unadorned, without warmth, landed harder than if he'd shouted. "The full $45,213,880 is now held in the David Paul Legacy Trust, managed by Vanguard Fiduciary Group, with Lydia Farrow serving as trustee. It is irrevocable. Neither of you nor Serena may ever serve as trustee, advisor, or beneficiary of that trust under any circumstance. I drafted it that way myself." Harrison's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "You had no right. She had every right," Elias said. "She's 18. It's her inheritance. It was always going to be her decision, Harrison. You simply assumed it would be yours." There was a long pause. I watched Serena's face shift from confusion to horror as the math finally landed for her. No Porsche, no marketing fund, no relaunch. Just her father's failing company. Still failing, exactly as failed as it had been the day before. "One more thing," Elias said. "Paul Family Capital LLC was filed using David Paul's name and likeness in its formation documents, and referenced his estate in investor materials Harrison has apparently already been circulating. Materials Wren has copies of, along with the full draft trust document you presented to her this morning under duress, on the day she turned 18. I'd strongly encourage you to consult independent counsel before you say anything further to her, on the record or off. I'll be in touch with your attorney, Mr. Bancroft, this afternoon." The call ended. Harrison stood frozen for a moment, staring at the phone like it might still be listening. "You had no right to go behind our backs," my mother finally said, her voice shaking, though I genuinely could not tell if it was from anger or fear or both. "We are your family. You tried to steal $36 million from a 17-year-old, I said. "I think I get to decide what family means after that. I wish I could tell you it ended there, in the kitchen, clean and simple. It didn't. What happened over the following 6 weeks was slower, uglier, and far more public than I expected, because Harrison, it turned out, had not been careful." Elias's associate pulled the formation documents for Paul Family Capital LLC and found that Harrison had used projected trust assets, my father's money, as collateral representations in a private funding round for Voss Capital Dynamics that had closed 19 days earlier. 19 days, before I'd even turned 18, before the money was ever legally his to promise. That detail changed everything. It moved this out of uncomfortable family dispute territory and into something a securities attorney would recognize instantly: potential investor fraud. Detective Marcus Ibarra, a 14-year veteran of the LAPD's Commercial Crimes Division, opened an inquiry after one of the defrauded investors, a Newport Beach venture fund called Tanager Partners, filed a formal complaint when the promised capital infusion never materialized. Detective Ibarra later told Elias, in a call I sat in on, that the case was about as clean as financial fraud cases get because Harrison had put the misrepresentations in writing, in an investor deck, with dates. Separately, the California State Bar opened a review into Lance Bancroft, the attorney who drafted the original Paul Family Capital documents, after Elias filed a formal grievance alleging Bancroft had drafted a trust diversion instrument for a client he knew to be the mother of a minor beneficiary, structured to take effect the literal day that minor turned 18, a pattern the bar's ethics investigator, a woman named Priya Anand, described in her preliminary letter as raising serious concerns under Rule 1.7 regarding conflicts of interest and undue influence. And then there was Dr. Naomi Feld, a licensed family therapist with 18 years of practice, whom I started seeing twice a week starting that July, not because a court ordered it, but because Elias gently suggested that surviving something like this without support tends to catch up with you later, usually at the worst possible time. Dr. Feld was the one who helped me understand that what I'd felt for 6 years, that low hum of not quite belonging, the sense that my affection was tolerated rather than returned, wasn't paranoia, it was accurate perception. She never told me how to feel about my mother. She just helped me stop apologizing for what I already knew. There was also Renata Cho, a forensic accountant Elias brought in that August to trace exactly how far the $12 million earmarked for Voss Capital Dynamics would have traveled if the transfer had gone through. Her report, 31 pages long, wasn't something I needed for any court proceeding. The money had never moved after all, but Elias thought I should see it anyway. Sometimes you need the paper trail of the disaster that didn't happen, he told me. so you stop lying awake wondering if you overreacted. Renata's projections showed that within 14 months, based on Voss Capital Dynamics' existing burn rate, the entire $12 million would have been gone, absorbed into payroll, office leases, and consulting contracts paid to two firms that, as it turned out, were owned by Harrison's college roommate. I read that report twice. The second time, my hands didn't shake at all. That surprised me more than the numbers did. I won't pretend the months between that August and the following spring were easy. There were nights I sat on the floor of my dorm room, once I finally got there, staring at nothing, replaying the sound of Harrison's voice saying, "Let's see how long your little rebellion lasts." There were mornings I woke up angry at people who weren't even in the room with me anymore. Dr. Feld had a phrase for that too. She called it residual vigilance, the body staying braced for a fight that had technically already ended. It fades, she told me, slowly, unevenly, but it fades. By August, Voss Capital Dynamics had collapsed entirely, its remaining investors pulling out en masse once the Tanager Partners complaint became public in a Los Angeles Business Journal piece about family office fraud among LA's aspirational elite. Harrison was named, so was the LLC. So briefly and painfully was I described as the teenage heiress whose inheritance was allegedly targeted, though Elias had prepared me for that possibility, and I'd had 2 weeks to steel myself before the article dropped. Lumiere RX quietly folded its remaining inventory into a liquidation sale on a discount site 3 months later. Serena posted one final video, tearful, artfully lit, thanking her small but mighty community, and then deleted her business account entirely. I didn't feel joy watching it. I felt something closer to the flat, tired relief you feel after a fever finally breaks. My mother filed for divorce from Harrison in September, once the fraud investigation made it clear his legal exposure could extend to marital assets. I don't know if that was self-preservation or genuine anger at him for putting her at risk, possibly both. She reached out to me twice that fall. One text asking if we could talk, just the two of us. One voicemail I still haven't fully listened to. I haven't responded to either. Elias says I don't owe her a timeline. Dr. Feld says the same thing, in gentler words. I'm trying to believe them. I'm 19 now. I go to school in Boston, a decision I made partly because it was a good program, and partly because it was 3,000 miles from a house that no longer feels like it belongs to anyone in particular. Harrison pled guilty to 2 counts of securities fraud last spring in a deal that kept him out of a longer sentence in exchange for restitution to the Tanager investors. Restitution he is, as far as I know, still paying off in installments that will likely outlast his 50s. Lance Bancroft was suspended from practicing law for 18 months. My mother lives alone now, in a smaller house in Sherman Oaks, and from what I hear through the thin, unreliable channel of Serena's old Instagram followers, she works part-time at a design firm and has not spoken to Harrison since the plea deal. The David Paul Legacy Trust still sits exactly where Elias and Lydia built it, untouched by anyone but me, growing quietly the way my father probably intended it to all along, before other people decided they knew better than a dead man's wishes. I use it for tuition, for rent, for a plane ticket home to visit Elias every few months, because he still keeps that fountain pen on his desk. And every time I see it, I remember that some inheritances aren't measured in dollars. I think about that morning in the kitchen sometimes, the blazer, the pastry with its unlit candle, the cheap blue pen they expected me to use to sign away my father's life's work. I think about Serena telling me to know my lane. I did in the end. I just built my own. They lost everything they tried to steal from me. Harrison lost more than that. He lost the one thing you can't buy back with a plea deal or a restitution schedule, the version of himself he'd spent 6 years performing. The good stepfather, the visionary founder. That man never existed. My father's money simply made sure everyone else found out. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not about revenge, even though I know how satisfying it feels to hear the word. It's about the 20 minutes I spent in a kitchen doorway at 6:40 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday, deciding not to look away from a notification that wasn't mine to read. Sometimes the whole shape of your future is sitting on a countertop, unlocked, waiting to see if you're brave enough to open it. I was. I'm glad I was.